Thank you. That was a really nice introduction. And after hearing about my research interests, you're probably wondering why I'm here to talk about the corporate university, which has nothing to do with oil or fertilizer. But as a part of the labor studies working group, we've been involved with trying to call attention to issues of academic labor, and that includes grad students and also contingent faculty and staff and other workers across the university. So we've been really involved with thinking about these processes of the corporatization of the university. So I've been thinking about this stuff for a while, and I want to thank Lynn for inviting me to talk today, because it actually forced me to actually come up with something to say about this, which I haven't really had to do yet. So I really appreciated this opportunity to kind of put some thoughts together, and we'll see. I look forward to hearing what you think. Okay, so some of you, most of you, were probably around close to 2 years ago in the fall of 2014 when the general body occupied the administration building. This is one of the most prominent signs that hung in Crouse-Hinds and really posed the question, is this a school or a corporation? And it was being involved with that occupation, the repercussions of it, the continuing activism around corporatization that actually caused me to want to teach a course on this, which I did this previous, well, we just ended it, this spring. And it's through teaching this course where I've really been forced to kind of think a lot about the issues I want to talk about today. And a lot of what I'll talk about is kind of very quick reflection on this process of teaching this course. The first thing I want to bring up, one thing that surprised me is I sort of assumed a class called the corporatization of the university would enroll, the typical general body activist and other people very critical of what's going on in higher education. But actually a good portion, close to half of the course, were very resistant, I would say, to this more critical way of thinking about what's happening at universities. And it was very interesting classroom dynamics. These individuals who all shared the same kind of demographic and gender backgrounds would all sit on one side of the room, and they would all kind of scowl and kind of have their arms crossed, and they would all kind of be constantly pushing back to some of what the other students were saying, with many of which were these general body activists who sort of took for granted this idea that corporatization is happening, it's wrong, and yet there's this really interesting, sometimes really productive tension in the classroom between these two camps, literally seated on opposite sides of the room. It's kind of stressful for me to moderate this, but it really got me into thinking about how this issue of corporate university is not just this thing up in the clouds. It's actually happening within all of us, within the student body, within the university itself. So we often think about corporatization as sort of external forces, these nefarious forces, corporations in particular, who come in and kind of colonize the university and do terrible things to the university. But with this title today, I'm trying to get us to think about how, maybe not all of us, but how the corporate university itself is actually reproduced in much more everyday ways and much more sort of ordinary ways through which all of us kind of reproduce through practices and logics these kind of these corporatized or how I'll talk about kind of privatizing type of logics that reproduce the corporate university. And what I want to argue today is that what's going on in higher education is not just internal to higher education or universities, it's a product of larger societal ideologies that have actually been a product of larger societal and political shifts over the last 30 or 40 years. So what I want to kind of get away from is thinking of corporatization as this kind of external force, or even something that's purely contained by, say, the administration of a university. It's something that kind of reflects the larger politics, the larger society in which we live. So first I thought I'd ask, when we say corporatization, again, a lot of us might take for granted what that means. But I think there's actually many meanings you could have. So I wanted to at some risk, sort of send it out to the crowd. What do you all think when you think of corporate, in particular corporate university? Yeah.
Business.
Business. So corporations are private businesses.
Profit-driven.
Profit-driven. So that's been a key theme that we've talked about all semester long. Is what kind of characterizes a corporation is that imperative, really a fiduciary responsibility to pursue profits on behalf of your shareholders. What else? Anything else? What do we know about, for instance, Syracuse University? Is it, legally speaking, is it a for-profit corporation? No, right? It's, yeah. You know, you can make arguments about what it is, but legally speaking, it is not a corporate university. We have things called corporate universities, and these are actual for-profit higher education institutions. Like, this is a picture of ITT Tech in Liverpool, I guess, outside of Syracuse. The University of Phoenix now has naming rights to a whole stadium where I guess the Arizona Cardinals play. That's sort of amazing to me that a for-profit higher ed corporation could actually have that much clout to actually buy naming rights to a stadium. So these are real corporate universities. So one thing about Syracuse in most universities, and especially public universities, is they are certainly nonprofit, and that creates things like Syracuse University is, I don't know if you can read this, but it's the largest property owner in the city of Syracuse, and because it's a nonprofit institution, it doesn't have to pay taxes on that property. So that really affects, the finances of the city of Syracuse, and Syracuse's nonprofit status really creates a whole set of benefits that they accrue from that status, but also we should argue it also beholdens them to have a certain set of obligations to the larger public, right, for being that status of non-profit university. So profit is sort of vague idea of being for profit is what we think of when we think of corporate university. What I want to think about again is to think about corporatization of higher education as part of a larger societal and political shifts that have happened throughout history. So thinking about this is actually a historical process that is part of larger societal and political systems. And people, like you did get from my introduction, I do study kind of political and economic history in relation to oil and other resources. Those people that look at this history really see a lot of shifts happening around the 1970s and really in 1980, where politics, especially in the United States, is claimed, historians will say there was kind of a rightward shift of politics. That doesn't mean, it means kind of the whole political spectrum, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, everything's kind of shifting rightward. And there's a lot of aspects of this shift that people talk about. I tried to come up with a less sensational word, but I just stuck with evisceration of the public sector. Since 1980, we've had cutting and a sort of decimation of the public sector as something that is meant to, whether it's to provide welfare or education or healthcare, it's been systematically cut, chipped away at, and it's rooted in, again, these larger ideologies, like old Ronald here. This idea that government is this sort of big, hulking, bureaucratic thing filled with red tape and burdensome regulations that needs to be scaled back. But this, apart from sort of cutting the public sector in general, there's been declining notions of, we've lost this sense that there should be institutions that are devoted to something called the public good. This is another classic quote of this era. There's no such thing as society. There's only individuals, men, women, and their families. So this idea that kind of society doesn't even exist, that it's only individuals, has become more prominent. This ideology of individualism and privatism has become more prominent really in the last 30 to 40 years. And as a product of that, and as we'll talk about, that is why, or not the only reason why, but one of the main reasons why we have seen declining public support for higher education. This is mostly seen at state level, right, where states are cutting their budgets, and one of the first things they'll look to cut is money for higher education, and this has led to a lot of states having to force their financing on higher education on tuition dollars rather than public budget dollars. So there's been a retreat of public investment in higher education as a product of these larger shifts. I was glad Glenn mentioned austerity, which apparently is not here. You guys get a happy hour. But one of the kind of ever-present sort of parts of this political shift is this kind of assumption of constant austerity. Certainly we've seen that at Syracuse University for the last 3 years. This sort of assumption that, and this is societal-wide, that everything kind of costs too much and we need to do everything we can to cut costs and cut and make things more efficient and streamline things and cut programs and cut costs. So this obsession with cost cutting is a larger kind of ideological part of this historical shift. And another way to put that is this kind of mantra that you hear constantly, especially at universities, that we just need to do more with less. This idea that the less is kind of assumed that is the starting point of a systematic kind of streamlining, cutting, and making things more efficient. And this is not just at universities, it's all across corporations, it's all across government, and all across society. Another way to put that is that simply we can't afford nice things. So a lot of what higher education is supposed to be about is about developing good citizens, developing intellectual curiosity and the humanities and the arts and things. So one of the big sinister forces of austerity is it's forcing universities to cut these things because we simply can't afford that because everything costs too much and we need to cut. We need to cut. So I got these quotes and I don't know if you can read them, but it's from this article I'm going to talk about in a second, where he collected these talks from various prominent politicians, where this is way back in 1967. Ronald Reagan says, there are certain intellectual luxuries that perhaps we could do without. Taxpayers should not be subsidizing intellectual curiosity. And then a slew of governors sort of making fun of majors that won't lead to a job, essentially. It is in the vital interest of the state to have more anthropologists. I don't think so. That's the governor of Florida. If you want to do gender studies, that's fine. Go to a private school, but I don't want to subsidize that. That's Governor Pat McCrory of North Carolina. Even President Obama. Folks can make a lot more potentially with skilled manufacturing or the trades than they will with an art history degree. And then Obama had to apologize for that statement because it turns out a lot of his base is actually people that think the arts are pretty important. And then of course, when he apologized, Marco Rubio, long rest his soul, is pathetic that Obama apology to art history, prof. We need more degrees that lead to jobs. So all this discourse, again, is saying, these things might be nice, gender studies, art history, anthropology, but they're not really going to lead to the efficient development of skills that will lead to jobs in this austerity economy. So we can't afford these nice things. Okay, so back to looking at these shifts. And even when you introduced my book, I did not plan to talk about my book. But sorry, I'm not really trying to promote it or anything, but it turns out when I'm talking about this larger political shift, what I argue in the book is that oil actually has powered, on the consumption side, a geography, if you will, of privatism, where people live in private single-family homes and suburban single-family homes. They drive using private automobiles, and this has created this kind of society of privatism for the people that can afford that kind of suburban type of lifestyle, and that has had, the argument of the book is that the oil has literally been a force powering this kind of geography of privatism. So that's all I'll say. But what I call this in the book is something called entrepreneurial life. This idea that your life itself is something purely produced by yourself, as an individual. And so the question of this ideology of entrepreneurial life is, what are you going to do with your life? And I'm sure you all remember when you first heard that question. When I was a child and I first heard that question, I found it quite terrifying. This idea that your life is something you individually decide what to do and produce sort of on your own. And so the definition is that society itself is a kind of amalgamation of individual enterprises, where your life chances are really determined by your own individual choices or work ethic. And this is an idea of like life chances or what happens in your life have nothing to do, again, with larger societal forces, larger public investments into things like education, or ironically, I discussed in the book that these suburban privatist lifestyles were funded through massive public investment in housing and highways and infrastructure, but yet it created this kind of private individualistic ideologies that came out of that. So I actually want to talk, I think this is kind of the core of what I'm talking about when I talk about we are all the corporate universities, that so many of us have enrolled this ideology of entrepreneurial life that it kind of clouds what we think of. And at the center of this, if we're all individual enterprises, is a kind of imperative that we must be competitive, that we need to enhance our competitiveness, and that's really what it's all about. So what I want to talk about today is really how education has become one of the primary means through which we are supposed to enhance our competitiveness in a marketplace. Again, I remember as a child when I was terrified to learn in like second grade that I was going to take a standardized test and it was going to somehow determine my life chances for decades to come. Or that my grades that I got in 5th or 6th grade would determine what kind of high school I could go to, and that would determine what kind of college and determine what kind of life I would have. So this idea that you make your life yourself through individual work and education systems is what I want to really talk about today, and how that has kind of really saturated how people think about education. So another way to think about corporatization is turning education into private profit, and by this I don't mean the profit of the university itself. I mean that we more and more think about higher education as a means to make profit for the individual students that enroll in it, right? So you see this type of discourse constantly that sure, education costs a lot of money and we're all upset about tuition being too high, but still a lot of data and studies show that it's still worth it, right? That those of us that get a degree, a BA or a BS in higher education are going to go on to have more lucrative careers, are going to make more money, we're going to have higher incomes. And so there's all sorts of data that shows that people with a bachelor's degree do way more, they make more money. And so the logic of higher education is more and more couched in this term. It makes you more competitive, it's going to create more profit for you as an individual, so of course you want to go. And I would add even Bernie Sanders, in his attempt to make higher education free, his logic, his argument is actually that in this economy today, it's actually a necessity to have a college degree. And that's why the public sector should actually make that free for everyone, because just like we did that for high school 50 years ago, when it was understood people need a high school degree to compete in the economy, we should do that for higher ed. But again, the focus is on making us more competitive, making us better enterprises. So back to these quotes. Again, what all these quotes focus on is, the basic logic around these quotes is the only thing higher ed is good for is to get you a job, right? And that actually, again, is very historically specific. So these quotes came out of this article, which I recommend you all Googling and reading. It's really provocative. And he traces this shift, again, Ronald Reagan right there at the center of it, where he says, when the purpose of college really changed towards getting a job became the primary purpose, where that wasn't always the purpose of college. So he presents this incredible data that actually is survey data of freshmen. And you can see this is 1971 all the way to 2013, shifting goals in life. This is the proportion or percentage of college freshmen that think the primary purpose it's a very essential or very important purpose of college to be very well off financially. So you can see that instrumentalist, competitive, kind of profit-oriented view of education really starts to go up in this era I'm talking about. And then, interestingly, you ask freshmen the same question, is the purpose of higher education to develop a meaningful philosophy of life? That, amazingly, was up near 70% back. College freshmen, 70% of them believed that was the primary or essential purpose of college. Surprisingly, this has declined. So he doesn't dumb it, but he kind of puts this in very simple terms. In the early 70s, nearly 3/4 of freshmen said it was essential to them to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. about a third, only a third felt the same about being very well off financially. Now those fractions have flipped. So that is what I'm talking about, is these larger societal shifts, political shifts, and so forth. So what I want to do is talk about how the corporate university gets performed and enrolled and reproduced by all these people here. So I want to go through undergrads, graduate students, faculty, and of course the administration, and then end with some possible solutions. So again, let's think about students as kinds of enterprises. Education and being competitive, that means education more and more gets reduced to the quantitative metrics that increase or decrease your competitiveness on a job market, which is grades. Students are obsessed more and more with grades. More and more I get depressed because my students seem more obsessed with their grades than they do with the actual content of the education or actually learning or intellectual curiosity. These things don't matter. All that matters is grades. I can guarantee you, by the time I finish this talk today, I'll have a new email from a student complaining about his or her grade, which I've been trying to swat away like flies for the last 2 days. And so this obsession with grades is because students more and more understand that that's what matters in terms of increasing their competitiveness and using higher ed as leverage to get a good job. But of course, they also see more and more higher education as something that needs to be a return on investment. That's what businesses do. They invest money and they expect that money to create more money, a profit or a return. And that's as egregious as the high tuition is for undergraduates these days, and the egregious amounts of student debt. I just got the average Syracuse University undergrad graduates with $36,000 in student debt, which is above the national average. So just like a corporation will take out loans to finance expansion of corporate activities, so do students. And so therefore, they really demand, and we can't really blame them, can we? They are paying tremendous amounts of money for their education. They demand a return on investment, and they understand that the grades are really the quantitative metric that allows them to get that return on investment. So we often in the corporate university literature, we talk about, this real problem with universities. They treat students as consumers, and students are just seen as buying their education, and they more and more expect to be delivered this as if it's this kind of commodity for them. But they are, because we have created a society that has made higher education so freaking expensive, we can't, when I had students in my corporate university class say I'm going into tremendous debt for this university education, I demand that I get a return on this investment. So if we turn education into a costly commodity, we should not be surprised when the students themselves more and more act like consumers of the commodity. And that is really the problem here, where we have such costly education. It increasingly makes that education have to be reduced to what kind of profit can you get off that cost and investment. So this is the part of the story of undergrads actually becoming central to part of the corporate university and performing these logics that education is about competitiveness and investment. So let's get to grad students. I know this is probably the most, hits close to home. And a lot of this is just, my research is in other areas. A lot of this is purely anecdotal, but this is kind of my life as being a PhD student, a grad student. I want us to think about how grad students are really, they're kind of caught between markets. There's obviously, I know a lot of what you guys are going to talk about today is about the job market and whether or not you're going to get a job in academia or in some other sort of sector. A lot of what you do in grad school is preparing yourself for that market. But there's another market that we don't talk about too, which is a lot of you are in the classroom, right? A lot of you are TAs, a lot of you are instructors teaching in the classroom. So you're actually in the instructional market, if you will. You are being paid to teach classes at Syracuse University. So therefore you are laboring and working for Syracuse University. I was stunned to find a grad student in my corporate university class told me she had a fellowship where she had to TA like 2 out of the 5 years, or 3 or 4 or something. It was a prestigious fellowship. But then she told me that the year she has to TA, she has to teach on her own a 2-2 load, which is the same load I have to teach. And so, and I was like, wait, it's called a teaching assistantship. It's not called you teach 4 classes. And she just was like, oh yeah, but they said I was really lucky to have this fellowship. So but I was just like blown away that any department could allow their grad students to be teaching on their own, preparing, grading, a 2-2 load, and call it a teaching assistantship. That brings it to the issue that both a lot of grad students are both students and workers here. And that's a real dicey, this kind of political, are you a student or are you a worker, is really politically important to determine. And as many of you know, last year the university tried to dump many grad students onto the student health plan to classify you all as students, whereas you've been used to being on the employee health plan, which classifies you as workers. Because you are workers, you're performing labor for the university in the classroom, some doing just TA work where they're running sections and they're grading papers, but some, like this one in my class, who's actually teaching a 2-2 load or something like that. And many grad students, when they get further along, are teaching multiple courses at the university. So the corporate university will often talk about, we're developing these students to become famous PhDs, blah, 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 but I would argue what matters more to the corporate university is your role as workers and doing that cheap labor, to put it bluntly, for the corporate university. Just lost the point I was going to make. Oh, right. So, interestingly, at a faculty meeting, I was trying to talk to my colleagues about the fact, why do we keep admitting all these grad students when we know that the job market for them is not so hot, right? So why do we keep enrolling the same amount of grad students every year? Shouldn't we realize that this is creating a problem? And one of my colleagues replied that, well, we need the TAs. I'm like, oh, so that's the logic. So that's what I mean, like, what status matters more? For some institutional purposes, it's that we need the TAs. Well, that doesn't do, that kind of uses your status as a worker to extract this cheap labor, but it doesn't necessarily help you in your grad student aspirations, right? So there's other language here. Are you funded? And you should feel really you get great benefits from you're a funded grad student. Or are you paid? Like workers are paid. They get wages, they get incomes. They're not funded. And so when I taught this corporate university class, a lot of the undergrads were like, but these grad students that you're complaining about, they're so underpaid, but they get tuition remission, right? So that should be part of their salary, right? So you all who are making poverty level wages for your TA ships, you should count that, whatever, $50,000 as part of your salary, right? He also, one of the most really brilliant, I would say, and pernicious, or sort of, I can't think of the word, but he was just relentless in class. He did the calculations. He said, well, these grad students, they're only paid for 9 months out of the year, and they're only working 20 hours a week. So if you scale that up to a 40-hour work week, 12 months a year, they actually are making $38,000. But that, of course, assumes that in that extra 20 hours a week, they can just be workers that work at Starbucks or something. But again, I thought the university said their role is to be here to be students, right? So it's this real dicey kind of, are they workers, are they students? And that kind of becomes the grounds through which these politics are been out. So getting on to how grad students often think about their research. And here's where I'm talking about we are all the corporate university. I realize this is what I tell my grad students. You need to develop your own individual contribution. And this is this idea that, again, that there's this relentless competition and everyone needs to sort of do the cutting edge, new research, to say something new. And actually I realized that this is less about, we would romantically think about a university is supposed to produce knowledge to sort of further some sort of public good or or kind of be societally beneficial, but we've more and more reduced knowledge to whether or not you're innovative and you're making that kind of individualized contribution. It kind of goes against the idea that knowledge is collaborative and community-oriented and should have some sort of societal benefit. But again, it reduces grad student research to enterprises, each one trying to out-innovate the other, right? And of course, there's this whole problem where we talk about that, I'm sure this whole conference, there's this thing called the job market. When are you going to go out on the market? But that, of course, assumes that there is anything resembling a functioning market, which is, according, if you talk to an economist, is supposed to be something that functions smoothly, has an equilibrium between supply and demand, is perfectly competitive. But the academic job market is none of those things. So when we talk, we constantly in the hallway, we talk about, are you going on the market, the market, the market? That's, again, performing this kind of illusion about how these things actually work. And when we talk about how it's not a really functioning market, most people say, well, there's an oversupply of PhDs, and that's what I was maybe naively trying to get at when I was saying, why do we keep admitting all these grad students? But in one of the books we read called How the University Works, the author actually makes the point that we often problematize the oversupply of PhDs, but we probably need to, at a societal policy level, really think about the problem really is the under-demand for actually good paying instructional positions. And actually that is a product of choices by universities to underinvest in instruction and to invest more in grad students, TA-ships teaching 4 classes a year, or adjuncts and contingent faculty teaching 5-6 classes a year for poverty level wages. So this underinvestment in teaching and instruction is really the problem here, not the quote so-called oversupply. And if we change the policy of how we treat and value teaching at higher institutions, we would see there is no longer an oversupply of PhDs. So I did some research with some other grad students about geography and how they were doing. We actually you can get a list from the disciplinary organization on who got a PhD in that year. And so we did some research at the sophisticated method of Googling people. So we literally took 400 cells in a spreadsheet and we Googled all of them, and we tried to find out how are they doing on the job market. And this is, sorry, you can't really see this, but so 19% are in kind of a postdoc position, which is seen as a possible good conduit to a tenure track position. 24% are assistant professors. Tenure track positions, pretty good, but 1 out of 4 for, again, in many departments, it's kind of assumed that everyone will just go on to this magical tenure track position. If you're doing 1 out of 4, that's not great. Maybe okay in baseball, but not so good. Let's see, it's really bad. 22% not found. That to me is the best indicator. So a lot of these people just drop off the map entirely. Let's see, adjunct is 16%. So and then again, a lot of these part-time teaching positions are not prominently displayed on university websites, where you can see their picture and you see what courses they're teaching. So I guarantee you a lot of those not founds are adjuncting, or they're teaching in part-time positions across many campuses. But 16% we actually found people teaching, and a lot of those people were still teaching in the same place where they got their PhD, the same city, the same region, because that's how life happens. You get a teaching job, and you start teaching at places, and so forth. So again, this is not a picture of a really well-functioning market. And so that's what we kind of need to deconstruct. We need to stop, I think, even saying the job market, because it's not really a market. It's a much more system determined by power and policies that we need to kind of problematize and contest, I think. Okay, so on to faculty. How am I doing on time?
Got a little over 15 minutes.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to talk mainly about teaching tenure track faculty. But I've already talked a lot about how a lot of the instruction that happens on universities on a country level, 75% or something are non-tenure track faculty. But we need to think more deeply about how tenure track faculty often reproduce this kind of, you can even call it like a caste system of instruction where there's kind of feudal tiers of some people that get a lot of resources and value and other teachers that don't get that. So the question is, who actually undervalues teaching? And of course we tend to say, well, that's the administration because they're shifting all their budgets onto part-time positions and adjunct positions. But I want to bring up again, purely anecdotally, in my experiences at conferences, or even amongst my department, I won't name any names, but there's this culture amongst tenure track faculty that, teaching sucks. And I hate it, I can't wait to go on leave so I don't have to teach. And these are people that teach like a 2-2 load, and it's like, really? and this kind of undervaluing or under appreciation of what teaching is, and this idea that what really matters is your research, right? And this is something I was told when I first arrived at Syracuse, that what really matters for tenure is research, and if you can teach your way out of a paper bag, you're fine. You don't need to worry too much about teaching. So again, the undervaluing of teaching is not just administrations deciding to shift budgets to low-paid contingent faculty. It's this larger culture that I would say includes tenure track faculty that really undervalues teaching and denigrates teaching and says it's not really valuable. And we do this. We do this with grad students. We say, "Oh, you don't want to end up at a teaching college."
Yep.
You know. So, this is a larger. We shouldn't be undervaluing. Teaching is like one of the most important things we do. And we shouldn't have that culture of undervaluing. And if we do, we shouldn't be surprised when the institution starts undervaluing it in monetary terms, which is what we're seeing. Okay, but research-wise, we know that faculty are supposed to do research, and that there's this larger romantic idea that knowledge-producing university is going to advance the public good in some way, or even to advance. We have a broad notion of the public good, so whatever that. Discovering Einstein's gravity waves, whatever that stuff was. Like that idea that developing science and knowledge is really something that our society should value and benefit. But what the corporate university is all about is more and more creating knowledge as a means to create privatized profit. And that includes researchers themselves. Now, the first example of that is pretty obvious. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the course of teaching this class, I discovered there's a whole office on campus at Syracuse that's really specialized in helping researchers find ways to develop their research commercially, to develop patents, copyrights, and intellectual property over their research, which in effect is the antithesis of developing research for free dissemination and for the public good, because it's about enclosing your ideas and knowledge into privatized patents and intellectual property. So if you go to this website, you can click on this guide to the Inventor's Guide to Technology Transfer at Syracuse University. And it says, we encourage you to contact the Office of Technology Transfer to be aware of the options that will best leverage the commercial potential of your research. Blah, blah, blah. They have a whole staff that's there to help faculty basically profit off their research. And can I both publish and pursue patent protection? Yes. So this is like the obvious way, and a lot of people that write scholarly about academic capitalism have looked at the increasing universities' roles in kind of increasingly trying to harvest money out of research. This applies mainly to engineering and the sciences, we should point out. But I also wanted to point out another way in which this happens. Many of us, like myself, this is an article I wrote, and yesterday I tried to access this article on my home computer, and I discovered that unless I log into my institutional library, I have to pay $41, which is really, it's like a 9-page article. $41, that's like what you call a monopoly price for this article. And so we tend to think of knowledge creating privatized profit flowing to the researcher who develops patents and intellectual property, but we don't think enough about how faculty are constantly producing in journals that are controlled by for-profit corporations that are making money off your own hard intellectual work. And so that's profit harvested elsewhere, really outside the university itself. And really, again, the faculty tenure committees, we reproduce this. We say, oh, you shouldn't publish in that open access online journal because that's not prestigious enough. To be prestigious, this is actually the Annals of the Association. It's the most prestigious geography journal that exists. It just happens to be controlled by Taylor and Francis. And so this is the opposite of knowledge for the public good, because the lay public cannot access this knowledge. They have no access to this. So we think these ideas, we have these brilliant ideas, we're going to circulate them, they're going to create public good, but no one can read this and no one does. The only people that read this are other academics. And that's really a monetary barrier. So let's see how the corporation's doing. It's actually a corporation called Informa that owns Taylor and Francis. Thought I'd check out their stock price over the last couple of years. They're doing pretty well. It's going up. That's an upward trend. So that's the kind of profit that is harvested off research. And also, it harvests that profit by enclosing that knowledge and making it not accessible to the larger public. All right. This is sort of the easy one, right? The administration. When we think of the corporate university, we think of the increasing sort of bloat of the administration and the increasing high-paid positions that exist amongst the administration. What I want to bring up is that the struggle is kind of real for administrations, that their survival, especially Syracuse University's survival, which is tuition-based, we are funded through tuition. The revenues are totally contingent on attracting students. So there's this real, again, this is all about increasing discourses of competition and competitiveness. For universities, the struggle and the competition for student tuition dollars is real. And it's a very Darwinian struggle. I mean, Syracuse is competing with hundreds of other private and public institutions for those tuition dollars. And they're doing whatever they can to attract those students to enroll. So that's why we talk about this administrative bloat, which is real. But you look around and what is it consist of? A lot of it's marketing departments, a lot of it's essentially departments that are trying to increase Syracuse's ability to reach out to those student tuition dollars. So I was stunned to learn, someone told me recently that the study abroad office, which is Syracuse can say, look, we have these great study abroad programs, why don't you give us $50,000 to come here? The study abroad office has something like 30 employees, which was just stunning to me. That seemed like a really high level of employees. So what we call administrative bloat is often just this machinery trying to attract student tuition dollars. And it's hard to blame them because, again, if Syracuse University does not attract those tuition dollars, they will not function. So there's this kind of arms race to who can create the greatest student experience, which is very different than educational experience. Universities realize you don't attract students from saying you're gonna learn about the classics or philosophy here. You attract students by offering them a kind of lifestyle. I remember I told my students that when I was a silly, stupid high school student who didn't care that much about school, but knew I had to go to college. And the thing that attracted me to where I ended up, Colby College, was that they had cable TV. Which is just like ridiculous. I think very badly about my former high school self. But that's what they're trying to offer to students, this experience, this kind of amenities and so forth. And I'm glad I'm giving this talk now because just this week we have a great example of this. And I'm sure many of you saw the news about this massive revamping of the campus that's going to happen. And if you read the SU News article, it's so baldly about this. This is the Board of Trustees action reaffirms the university's commitment to offering a distinct student experience. So again, a student experience you can't get anywhere else. Say like, I don't know, Tufts. That includes an athletic stadium, an exceptional health and wellness resource, and university campus accessibility and safety, which is actually really important and good. But this, if you read the article, it's just constant. The campus framework will better meet the needs and expectations of today's college students and provide an unrivaled collegiate experience. I think experience is said something like 10 times in this article. Rebecca Reed Kantrowitz, the Student Affairs Dean, pleased the university will move forward. I'm particularly happy to see our students will soon have access. These poor students have not had access. The state-of-the-art health and wellness center, a resource our students say is especially important to them. So it's almost like, well, the students say it's important, we must give it to them. Because that's what we're after, right? To create the most unrivaled student experience. And of course the dome is so a part of that. The article goes on to quote the student president, the student association president, about how the dome has been such an incredible part of her experience by scoring Duke tickets and this kind of stuff. And this is an incredible investment. $255 million will go into this. So we're talking, a lot of people have talked recently, so we've saved all this money with the buyout and there's this kind of surplus in the budget, so where's all that money going to go? This might be where it's all going. $255 million as making a better roof and so forth. And then again, you see that the instructional staff at our university feels undervalued, underrepresented. So I bring this up, and every time I talk about this, but Jessica Posner, who is an adjunct part-time faculty in transmedia, she actually wrote a letter to the DO about this. And she said she was thrilled to accept a teaching position. She taught 5 classes last year, was paid $17,229 with no benefits. That's more classes than I teach. And she could not afford to pay her student loans. And she says, I sincerely hope the new administration's strategic plan will consider the realities of the ever-growing precarious populations on campus. More justice and fairness should be brought to the workers and students that make SU possible. I call upon the new administration to make academic life less painful and precarious for all. Well, we can debate on how the strategic plan has answered her call, but I would say they're showing with their money their investment again in this arms race of student experience than in terms of benefiting the actual instructional educational staff. Okay, finally, solutions. I'm probably out of time, roughly.
No, you've got 5 minutes.
Oh, perfect. So I wanted to think very romantically about what is university for, so I got Wendell Berry, very romantic thinker, and he says the thing being made in a university is humanity. Given the current influence of universities, this is merely inevitable. But what universities, at least the public supported ones, are mandated to make or to help make is human beings in the fullest sense of the word. Not just trained workers or knowledgeable citizens, but responsible heirs and members of human culture. If the proper work at the university is only to equip people to fulfill private ambitions, then how do we justify the public support? Underlying the idea of the university, the bringing together, the combining into one of all disciplines, is the idea that good work and good citizenship are inevitable byproducts of the making of a good that is fully developed human being. So what I've tried to argue today is because of larger societal ideological shifts, we've completely lost, and that's what this article is called, the loss of the university. We've lost this idea that that's what a university's purpose is for. In fact, in my class, I had students write their first paper after reading some of this literature about what's the purpose of higher education, what's the ideal university. Half of my students wrote the ideal university is one that gets you a job. So that's really clouded what a lot of people maybe romantically think about the real purpose of higher education. So one of the things, the more hopeful things, if I've not completely depressed all of you, is that history is always changing. And so this idea that these shifts that happened in the 70s and 80s are eternal and are that history is over and that they will always, these ideas and ideologies and politics will always be like this, it's just not how history works. History will shift. And so it's really up to us to shift it in ways that sort of get us away from this privatizing, corporatizing higher education system. To do that, we really need to revive the public mission of universities. When when and I'm sure all of us have sort of jokingly talked about philosophy majors and art history majors, when we do that, we're really denigrating the larger public mission of universities, developing thinkers, developing fully human beings, and that's okay. This idea we can't afford that. We're the richest country on the planet. We can't afford to develop people to study philosophy. And that idea that we could actually develop those people to revive the public mission of universities. And it's gonna, again, a lot of what I've talked about today is what these shifts have meant have been an increasing privatization and individualization of all kinds of educational systems. Whether that's undergrads only looking at their education in terms of individual grades, or grad students thinking about their individual innovative contributions. We need to revive collective action. We need to get together and organize collectively to stem these trends. So I thought I'd end by laying out some of the ways to do that. First, one collective agency are called departments. And departments actually have a lot of power to, for instance, departments are ultimately the ones that make hiring decisions about who's going to teach their classes. So departments could say, geography in particular has tried at least to steer away from hiring precarious contingent part-time adjunct faculty. We've tried to, I don't know if this is good, but we tried to give those positions to grad students who need that teaching experience, who are in their writing stages and so forth. What if all departments at SU decided we're no longer gonna hire these poorly paid contingent faculty? They have the power to do that. Whether or not they would, I don't know. There's also collective institutions at universities that are supposed to be part of this shared governance system, and we have those at Syracuse. It's called the University Senate. Came very close in the last Senate meeting to a vote of no confidence in the budget of the chancellor. It didn't quite happen, but the University Senate is supposed to be an institution of collectively organizing to actually share in the governance of the institution. But more and more, I hear from colleagues that, oh, you don't want to be a part of the Senate. It's a total waste of time, and it's boring, and it's terrible. But these are the institutions, the collective institutions that we need to kind of take over to really push back about these trends that are being forced down by administrations. Unions, very important institutions. And actually doing this course, we find in terms of governance of universities, there's some tension sometimes when a grad student or a faculty union is able to establish itself. It kind of becomes unclear about what jurisdiction the union has over decision making vis-a-vis the university senate or the kind of democratic agencies. But unions can be, again, develop collective bargaining to actually advance the interest of blocks of bodies on university campuses. So one of the things with grad student teaching at SU is it's a hodgepodge, sort of mishmash. Every department does it differently. But if the grad students at SU had a union, there would be standards and there would be collectively bargained sort of basis of pay and benefits and teaching conditions that have to take place for all grad student teachers. And you might not have a TA in some random department teaching 4 classes and calling it a teaching assistantship. There's some idea that we have the Adjuncts United Union, which has actually helped tremendously in terms of the pay and bargaining power of the part-time faculty at Syracuse. There's been recent NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, rulings that suggest that faculty might be able to unionize at private universities. They have been barred from doing so because of a Supreme Court decision in 1980 called the Yeshiva decision, but there's been recent rulings that suggest that might not be the case anymore. In fact, I have a friend at Point Park University, a private U in Pittsburgh, and they have formed a faculty union. So there might be a capacity for full-time faculty to form a union, and when you have a union, you have a collective organization that can advance the interest of the teachers, the researchers, of the actual educational meat of the institution. And of course, there's just politics, and that's what I wanted to talk about. This is a product of our larger politics, our larger society. So if we want to change what higher education looks like, we probably have to shift and change the larger political spectrum. So that includes activism on campuses, and we saw what the general body did a couple years ago really did shift the conversation at Syracuse University. And we've seen activism spring up all across college campuses. And we've learned that really, if you really want to get things done at a university, you should probably harness the power of the football team or the sports teams, because it took maybe 48 hours for the president of University of Missouri to resign after the Missouri college football team was basically going on strike. But of course, it's about our larger politics. You'll probably be shocked to know that I'm a fan of this guy. But if we were to shift our politics to what he calls a political revolution that actually created the institutions that would create free higher education for all, so many of these problems I've talked about today would be rectified. Because one of the problems of this arms race of tuition, of private universities increasing tuition to try to build this better student experience, if those students could just go to a really good public university for free, it would be like, well, we're not going to pay $50,000 to go. That would force private universities to kind of scale back in this competitive arms race tuition game. If we gave free higher education, we wouldn't have massive student debt, and therefore we wouldn't have lots of undergraduates looking for a return on their investment. We'd have undergraduates who are like, I'm going here for free, I want to develop, I want to learn. I want to develop myself as a human being rather than I want to get a return on investment. So if we made higher education not a cost, not an investment, as something as a right, a social right, then a lot of these problems, I think, would start to be chipped away at. But that, to get here, as we've learned, unfortunately, to get here, we need to do a lot of organizing politically to shift our politics to a kind of politics that would actually finance higher education for the population. So I will stop there. Thank you very much